Right, good afternoon, grade girls. Quite interesting because I don't want to greet you. I mean, I never remember to greet you when we start lessons. And yet every time I start a lesson, start recording a lesson, all of a sudden I find myself greeting you. It's very strange. Maybe I will change my behavior from here on. Right, so we're on the last part of this particular PowerPoint. And then we'll start one of the other 3 PowerPoints that we've still got to get through before we finish human reproduction. Okay, so we were busy on hormones that were concerned with pregnancy and labor and birth, etc. And I spoke about oxytocin and the fact that oxytocin causes the contractions of the uterus. So that's the beginning of labor pains, dilates the cervix, and it stimulates the release of milk. Now be very careful because there's a second hormone that I'm going to discuss now that doesn't stimulate the release of milk. It actually stimulates the development of the breast during pregnancy and the production of milk. And it's terribly important that you don't get those two mixed up. So oxytocin, the release of milk from the mammary glands when a baby is suckling. And in fact, I'm sure that a number of you know this, that females who are lactating, human females, so let's presume that a woman has had a baby and she is breastfeeding that baby. I don't mean breastfeeding as in the baby is now attached to the nipple and is busy suckling. What I mean is that she's not bottle feeding the baby during this time that the baby's growing, but she's actually also breastfeeding it, which means that the breasts and the mammary glands continue to produce milk as a result of the hormone prolactin that I'm going to talk about. But the oxytocin, as I said, stimulates the release of milk. Now, those mothers can be, let's say, for example, walking along in a shopping center and hear a baby crying, not her baby, somebody else's baby, and all of a sudden, the mammary glands actually release milk. So they start leaking. And that is the result of this hormone oxytocin. Okay, life is not easy. Having children is not easy. Don't do this thing until you're ready for it, guys. Okay, so we're busy on this hormone, prolactin. Now, you know that lact is to do with milk, because you know that lactose intolerant means that somebody is unable to digest the sugar in milk called lactose. Okay, so prolactin, okay, so a hormone to do with milk. It's produced and secreted by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So contrast that to oxytocin, which is produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior lobe and released by the posterior lobe. And this one promotes lactation. That means the production of milk by the mammary glands, not the release of milk, the production of milk by the mammary glands. And it's terribly important that you don't confuse those two. So this shows the structure of a non-lactating breast, in other words, a breast of a female, mammary gland of a female that is not breastfeeding a baby, hasn't just given birth, is not breastfeeding a baby. And you can see there's very little adipose tissue, a lot less adipose tissue in that breast, but a lot less of the milk-producing glands in the mammary glands. They're much smaller, they're not as well developed. Okay. And then this is a lactating breast, okay, and you can see lots of ducts opening at the tip of the nipple. Not to be confused with the nipple of a bottle used for feeding a baby milk formula, because that's got a single opening at the tip. This has got a number of openings. Okay, so the pituitary gland produces prolactin, which stimulates milk production, and then suckling stimulates the release of oxytocin from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which causes a contraction of the mammary glands to release milk. And very interesting, also triggers the uterus to return to pre-pregnancy stage. So they always talk about the fact that there are lots of pluses to a female breastfeeding a baby as opposed to bottle feeding a baby. Don't feel pressurized, any of you young ladies. Once you have a baby, what happens, happens. But one of the important things is the sort of turning of the uterus to the pre-pregnancy stage. And that's apparently much better if a female does breastfeed. Okay, labor and its hormonal controls. So the labor stage often lasts for more than 10 hours. Not necessarily a huge variation here. My lab assistant, when I worked in Durban, she was pregnant and she got up in the middle of the night and went to the loo and was walking back down the passage and felt one labor pain, and all of a sudden out popped the baby. Okay, so she only had a single labor pain, so it was nowhere near 10 hours. I think she was eternally grateful for that. So during labor, the cervix dilates and it's got to open to a diameter of 10 centimeters before the baby starts to be born, was able to be born. The trigger for dilation is the secretion of the hormone oxytocin. In this case, the oxytocin is produced by the fetus and the mother's pituitary, and it happens in response to the reduction of the progesterone levels. Because remember, the placenta is now pulling away from the endometrium, and so it's stopping production of progesterone. So oxytocin stimulates powerful contractions by the muscles of the uterus, which I believe are extremely painful. Oxytocin also stimulates the placenta to secrete hormones called prostaglandins, which enhance the contractions. And then the physical and emotional stresses associated with the contractions stimulate the release of more oxytocin and prostaglandins. So it's a positive feedback system that ultimately causes expulsion. Oh my word. So the expulsion stage lasts between 2 and 60 minutes. The contraction lasts about 50 to 90 seconds. And by the time of labor, they're about 1 to 2 minutes apart. And expulsion ends when the baby is pushed through the vagina. So the umbilical cord at that stage of the game is attached to the navel of the baby, and it still passes through the vagina. The other end goes through the vagina and is still attached to the placenta, which is still attached to the endometrium of the mother's uterus. So a while after the birth of the baby, the placenta has detached completely from the endometrium, and with a few contractions, it then passes out of the vagina as well. And that is referred to as the afterbirth. Okay, and I've showed you pictures of that in a previous slide. Okay. You don't have to know the stages of labor, but basically it goes. Remember, I said to you that the head has to be down. If the head is not down, then that's problematic. And so quite often, well, not necessarily quite often, but if that does happen, the caregiver, the medical person involved in this whole thing, it could be a gynae, it could be a midwife, it could be whatever, has to manipulate the baby to try and turn it within the uterus so that the head and the shoulders come out first. So what you see in the second stage is the head is passed through, and then one shoulder and then the other shoulder passes through, and then the rest of the body passes through quite quickly. So then the umbilical cord is cut, okay? So there's a little section of the umbilical cord that is attached to the navel still, And the rest of the umbilical cord, because it's actually clamped at this end and clamped on the baby. And that's important, obviously, because there's still blood flowing through this thing. Okay, and here's the placenta within the uterus, and it's busy detaching. In other words, it's pulling away from the endometrium. And then that would have to pass out as the afterbirth. Okay, I've already spoken about that one. Okay. One of the things I need to mention is something called an ectopic pregnancy, which is for interest only, but it is quite important that you sort of have an idea of this. So sometimes an ectopic pregnancy can occur, and there are a number of different places that an ectopic pregnancy can occur. So it's a pregnancy where implantation has, instead of occurring in the uterus, it implanted some other site. And it can happen in a number of places. It can happen on the outside of the ovary. It can happen on any other organ within the abdominal cavity, that the zygote has fallen back out of here and implantation has occurred there. Or the egg cell fell out of the fallopian tube, didn't get pulled into the fallopian tube, and sperm have managed to pass the end of the fallopian tube and fertilize that egg cell wherever it is, and implantation has occurred anywhere else. And implantation in a different part of the body other than the lining of the uterus is actually very, very possible. All right. So now this thing is moving, the embryo is moving down the fallopian tube. It is possible for it to get caught in the fallopian tube and implant there and start growing and start making a placenta there. So here you can see a fallopian tube. There's a fallopian tube. Okay. Here's the here's the little embryo developing. Okay. This would be a fallopian tube on one side, fallopian tube on the other side. Here's the uterus, and here's an embryo developing in this side of the fallopian tube. Now, it's actually life-threatening. There's not enough space for the embryo to grow. So the embryo grows and grows as much as it can, and it eventually causes a bursting of the fallopian tube, and it results in a lot of bleeding. Now, first of all, that little embryo is going to die in any case, because the placenta is no longer going to have a blood supply. But it's actually possible for the mother to die as well from blood loss. And unfortunately, this is something that a mother is sometimes not aware of until it's actually too late. Okay, so you must answer the questions on page 87 of the textbook, and I will release those at a later stage, the memo for those. And your job now for the rest of the minutes remaining of this lesson is to learn this work. So the next 3 sets of PowerPoints or sets of slides that I'm going to go through, we've finished the actual process of reproduction, and you are, in fact, in theory, ready for an assessment. So I'm asking you now, I'm telling you now, learn.